afternoon, good evening, everybody. 6:33 here in the Fox 6 newsroom here. We are continuing the coverage that we started during our election special just a few minutes ago because we have two guests who are pretty good at talking politics. We know Dr. Mordecai Lee has been with us many times on election night, pre-election night, and Dr. Paru Shaw. I said that correctly, right, Dr. Shaw? You are both on the faculty at UWM. And there's so many things I want to talk about. We might double up and talk about things we just did. I feel a little bit like we're on a political dating game here a little bit. Like candidate one, if I told you my favorite president was Teddy Roosevelt, what kind of date would that be? But I like to laugh because politics is so entertaining, and this year it is entertaining as well. But you said something to me when we were talking the other day on the phone. This is a historic race, and yet it's not a historic race. Can you clarify those two statements?
Sure. I mean, I think it's historic in the sense that we haven't had an African American on the ticket running for elected office, right? And if you think about Milwaukee in 2022, people might be surprised that it's been this long, right? But so that part I think is historic. I think in other ways, though, we had a non-contested primary, right? There was no Republican on the ticket, and so in some ways, like, again, you know, like people might be thinking to themselves, are either of these candidates really that different?
Well, we say there's no, I mean, it's a nonpartisan race, so nobody's going to identify, but Bob Donovan has gotten the support of the Republicans running for governor, for example, have said if you're voting in Milwaukee, Bob Donovan's the guy we support. So there's a little more contrast than there might be.
Yes.
But to your point, it's not a stark difference.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay.
That we're debating, right?
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think there's a stark difference.
Okay.
It's South Side versus North Side. It's African American versus the old white ethnics, the Reagan
It's
Democrats.
generational and race.
Absolutely. And so this might be the last hurrah of the old South Side. When Mayor Meyer was mayor for 28 years, his anchor was the South Side, those pro-union, blue-collar, East European ethnics who voted for him. They wanted conservative policies. They weren't liberals like the East Side. And then you've got African American voters who tilt towards more liberal, more social reform, more social equity. I think it's something of a showdown, not just between races, but between ideologies.
I mean, the only thing I would say, though, is that I think that even the ethnic kind of voting bloc, I think, has shifted dramatically in the last 20 years.
Right.
Right. And so I don't think, even if all of the Bob Donovan's kind of supporters were in that group, that would not be enough. I think you would agree with me, for him to win this race.
That's right. The South Side has changed. Mayor Meyer's South Side is gone.
Let's talk about how much has changed, because you bring up a really good point there, Doctor, that in 20 years ago, basically 18 years ago, we had the last open race for mayor, and we're going with the demographics of that time. There were more white voters than there are now. There were more black voters than there are now. And the Hispanic population went from 12% then to 20% now. Add in the Asian population, that gets us up to 25%. 1 out of 4 voters does not identify as black or white. They identify as Latino or Asian. Now, I'm not lumping those groups in together in a voting block because who knows how each group votes. But it does talk about a changing demographic of the city, and you literally teach courses in this that has an effect.
Right, definitely. And I think that I think the history of like racial segregation in Milwaukee meant that for a long time, white politicians won based just on those segregation patterns and having that voting block, and that is not going to be the case anymore in 2022. And to your point, it's not clear necessarily what those multiracial coalitions will look like, but they have to exist. Nobody can count on just their own racial voting bloc to win an election.
And I think one of the unpredictable factors is the law and order campaign by Alderman Donovan. You know, he used to be associated with conservative, Republican, but because of this situation of crime in Milwaukee and reckless driving, are there some voters today and tomorrow morning who are saying, gee, I usually voted for the more democratish, but I think crime in Milwaukee is really in bad shape, and we need a law and order mayor. And so that would be
we literally had a law enforcement officer on the primary ticket. We had the sheriff running. And so I'm wondering, why did that not connect? There was an African-American candidate who was well-known and popular. So if they were going law and order, wouldn't they have gone for the guy who literally wears a badge?
You know, he had a 20-year history as the alderman who was always pro-police union, pro-hiring more police.
We're talking Donovan here.
Donovan.
Yeah.
And so he was able to really drown out whatever Sheriff Lucas would have been able to say.
Fair point there. How do candidates reach these very different audiences now.
Oh, in terms of mobilizing voters and
Yeah.
trying to get out. I mean, I think, of course, Cavalier Johnson has the ability to have that name recognition, and so does Bob Donovan. I mean, I think you're pointing out that huge primary field, I think some of those candidates, we're not going to be able to compete with that kind of name recognition. And, you know, I think now during COVID, you really have to get out there and start talking to folks again. I think people are ready to have those conversations and say, like, what are you going to do for me if you are elected to mayor? Like, what is my vote getting me? And, you know, again, I think since 2016, I feel like there's been more cynicism in voting and this feeling of, as I said earlier, like all candidates are kind of the same. And so how are you really different in this situation, I think is something that they're going to need to be able to differentiate themselves.
You know, Mayor Meyer had a machine, and it was anchored in the South Side. There aren't any machines anymore in the city of Milwaukee politics. I think it's all friends and neighbors. It's these micro networks of, I go to church with so-and-so. My brother-in-law is married to so-and-so. And so it's very hard for public opinion polling to pick up on that. But I think there are a lot of people who, based on this word of mouth, have decided who they're going to vote for.
The influence of partisan politics here is obvious, and it used to not be there. But we talked about that, and I ask, is it such a horrible thing on a village trustee race or a school board race to ask the politics? For example, I live in Whitefish Bay. There are 3 candidates running for 2 seats, and I asked 3 questions. One had to do with something I want in Whitefish Bay, which doesn't really matter. The other was Silver Spring. What are we going to do about that? And the other, I asked a question that I would never have asked candidates before. What is your take on the 2020 election? What do you think, what side are you on? What do you think happened in that election? It was a flat-out question. I just wanted to know what side they were on, and I got my responses for that. I would have never thought to ask that, but that's the influence of national politics on a local level.
You know, 100 years...
And is that good or bad?
Well, 100 years ago in the progressive movement, when it really tried to change American politics, the magic word was merit, making decisions based on the merits. And so the question becomes, now that we've got these de facto partisan candidates, are they really going to make a decision about a school or a village ordinance on the merits? Are they open-minded, and are they willing to compromise, or are they closed-minded? That's what I'm afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, so I'm also on my local school board, and I think one of the things that I always say is that I think it's a nonpartisan issue that we want our kids to be successful, to learn something in school, right? I think we would all agree, no matter what your partisan background is, that that's true. And the ways in which things that used to not be partisan have become partisan, I think is the part that's problematic, because I would be worried if folks were like, well, I'm only going to vote for somebody who believes that, you know, believes in some sort of Republican policy in Washington that's really not going to actually affect us here, right?
And how do we educate, and then maybe this isn't, feel free to say, we're not doing our job right. How do we educate voters into that? I mean, you're speaking directly to students, so you have some influence there, and you're on a elected body. But how do we say just what you said? Go vote on the merits. Stop going what color that person is or what color that is. By that I mean red or blue.
Right. I think the magic word is compromise. In other words, does the voter want to elect an elected official who is willing to cross the chasm with somebody from the other side? Is half a loaf better than none? Or is the opposition the enemy, the devil? And so if we can elect candidates who believe in compromise, then government can start working again.
I also would say I love that you asked your candidates questions. You know, I think, again, if there's going to be low turnout in a mayoral race, there's going to be even lower turnout in a race where there is nobody on the ballot except a few local candidates. And so get involved. Ask them the questions. Don't believe, you know, that, oh, I heard. I mean, I 100% believe that there's a neighbors network, and I think that works great. But I think sometimes you just need to ask them, like, so what do you think about this? And get them to tell you what they would think.
And in a way, I equate it to going down to spring training. You get to be near the players and talk to them a little bit. I was so impressed with all the 3 candidates.
That's great.
They were back to me within an hour and a half, all of them. And I didn't expect to hear from any of them for days. And so there is that, but that shows, and that gets us into turnout, okay? 1 out of 5 voters in the city of Milwaukee showed up to vote in the primary. And you had a lot of different candidates up there. How do we get more people involved? I've been a political junkie. I was born into a political junkie family. So you know, I vote in every election. Only once. I see you looking at me like that. You're from Chicago. I can tell where your next joke is going to be. But how do we get more people to turn out when it's so important? And their votes are so important with fewer people voting.
So I'm going to put on my voting rights hat and say, like, part of it has to do with the fact that we live in a state where voting has become more difficult, right? And there's I think there's action towards that. It would be great if, you know, I'm really happy that we have early voting, that we have the ability to kind of get your absentee ballot, but the things that were put in place for 2016 and 2020, some of those have been rolled back, and that doesn't help voter turnout. People don't want to necessarily wait until Tuesday to get to the polls. They don't necessarily want to go in person. So giving people opportunities, I think, is really important. And then I think the mobilization, to your point, I think if people feel like their vote is going to make a difference and feel like I'm excited about that candidate, then I think those are two other pieces that are important.
As you talk to students, and hold that thought for 1 second, as you talk to students, do you feel they're engaged, or do you feel a cynicism that I feel would very sad if there was a cynicism among college kids? I wouldn't blame them, but that is the time almost to be optimistic and say, I can now vote. I'm going to go change the world.
So in their defense, what I would say in terms of their cynicism is that it's rare to have a politician who speaks to them, who talks about the things that they care about, right? Better transportation in the city. If it's a presidential politician, something about college funding, right? Like, it is rare to have politicians speak to them. And so I think they often are like, it doesn't matter. But they are excited. I mean, I do think, I've also been a poll watcher, and I would say that the 18-year-olds who are walking in to vote for the first time are super excited. And so, again, it's about informing people about, like, these are your options, this is why it's exciting, the birthday of democracy, right? Like, I think those things can be mobilizing.
You know, the good thing about social media is that people can decide right now that they want to vote. And they can go online, they can find the websites for the candidates running for the various offices where they live. They can find out exactly what you found out when you contacted them. Yeah. And they can decide now to vote tomorrow. And maybe that's the best of social media, because they can find out what they care about. What I care about might be different from what another person cares about. If they can figure out what do I care about and what politician is speaking on
and
that.
Who's going to get me that? Yeah. Right. Or who aligns with my thought on that.
Right.
You're going to laugh at the example. I think we should have chickens at Whitefish Bay. All right.
This is a thing.
This is a thing. Yes. And I've tried this with different trustees over the years, and have gotten a look of, "Are you kidding me?" to now, some candidates saying, "Oh yeah, I lived in X place. They had them. This could work." Okay. Well, that's an answer that connects with me. It's not the most important issue, but it is an issue. Let's talk state politics here, because we're going to have a governor's race. And we now have a couple people running for the Republican side. We have 3. We might have 4. Tommy Thompson, the long-serving Republican governor, goes down to Mar-a-Lago last week and talks to Donald Trump. We don't know the specifics of that, but you have to think in a way he was looking for a blessing. Does that surprise you that Tommy Thompson went to President Trump?
Tommy is a great politician, and he loved being governor. And he doesn't think that at 80 years old he has to go out and just play sheep's head for the rest of his life. He wants to be governor again, but he understands how the Republican Party has changed. And I think it was a smart move for him to become acceptable to President Trump, even if he doesn't get endorsed. And I think rolling together everything we've talked about, democracy works best when the people have choices. And so if there are 3 or 4 people running on the Republican side for governor, and there are 5 or 6 running for U.S. Senate on the Democratic side, those are choices that the voters can really decide what their ideology and what they believe in should be the paramount thing.
And just to be clear, that's not on the ballot tomorrow. We will go to the polls August 9th for that. Did you have something you wanted to add to that when I asked about Tommy Thompson perhaps getting back in the race again?
I mean, you know, he was our interim, what was it, provost? No, president.
President of the UW system.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
And so I would agree with you that at 80 he has no interest in stopping.
Why is, and I was going to look up the different, I was almost going to say we can find one now. Ron Johnson is not being primaried. He's the Republican candidate and will be in November. Why is he spending so much on ads now then? What's the philosophy there?
The conventional wisdom is you never wait. It's never too early to start. And in fact, for those of us watching TV, we've seen anti-Ron Johnson ads for the last year. And so he's trying to catch up. The thing a candidate doesn't want is to go dark. In other words, to go off the air, because now television is the whole ballgame. So I think he's being smart the way he's doing it.
But what's the old saying? How can I miss you if you don't go away? I mean, so and I'm not suggesting that to Senator Johnson. I'm just saying, wouldn't this be a time to go? I'm the incumbent. I'm working. I'm doing things here. I'll see you in late summer to come back and tell you what I'm going to do. It almost is like, how much do we need to see of you?
I mean, if there was ever a few years where the incumbency advantage is in question, I think these last few years have proven to be true.
Really?
And so, yes.
Explain.
Oh, just, I think there are a lot of incumbents who are either finding themselves in hotly contested primaries, Ron Johnson not being one of them, but some who are being contested by, folks who are seen as even more partisan or polarizing. And I think this is a seat that is seen as one that Democrats could win, right? So there is some sense that if he doesn't do everything he can as soon as he can, it would be a mistake.
How much of this election, this spring election, has worked its way into your classroom lectures, or has it?
You mean in terms of tomorrow's race?
Yeah.
We always talk about local politics.
Okay.
I think, for me, I think state and local politics are a kind of a laboratory of democracy in some ways, right? You can see what's happening here, and yes, what's happening in Congress and the presidency is important, but in these smaller races, you can see how, context, the communities people live in, the kinds of elections that have happened prior, the history of a city like Milwaukee in terms of, when and if we've elected a black mayor, I think are really important topics.
And when I was teaching, and I shifted to emeritus 3 years ago, students always talked like they were on talk radio. They always had these sort of adjectives to put down or to praise. So I said, we can talk about politics in class, no adjectives. And at first, they really had trouble doing that because they wanted to demonize one side and praise the other. But as soon as we got rid of the adjectives, they were really talking to each other, and there was a real step forward.
How did you come upon that to say that's the bit of the problem here?
Luck.
Okay.
I didn't want to shut them down in terms of talking about politics, but it seemed that this was a way to do it more constructively.
Gotcha. I'm going to turn my back on both of you, not because I don't love you both. Any questions coming in on the Facebook?
Yeah, well, it's on Facebook, but I posted it, so I don't know if that counts. The candidates, you hear them talk, they talk about the same priorities, right? We want better schools and safety, and you kind of go, well, yeah, doesn't everyone? I mean, what are the key, can we just kind of go over the key differences with the mayoral candidates?
Sure, as much as you're comfortable doing that when it comes, and as you saw in our special, Mary Stoker Smith went to all parts of town and said, what is important to you? And the number one answer, hands down, was crime. How do you look at a candidate and say, yeah, I believe you can do this, and I don't believe you can do that, and vice versa? How they haven't had the job yet, right? So if Barrett were running, he could run on his record. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing isn't for me to say. But these two guys haven't had the office. Well, one has on a short-term basis.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that he's going to be judged on that short-term basis in some ways, and judged by the fact that he's been in office from 2016 and was selected by Barrett, right? So seen as kind of his kind of continuing his legacy. I would say that I don't know if a voter can look at one candidate or the other and say oh, this person is definitely going to change how we do policing in this city. I think they both have plans though and ideas about understanding what the problem is and solutions that they think would work. I don't know if I have other things to say about that.
I think for voters, what rings true? In other words, if former Alderman Donovan says, we need more cops, does the voter say, you're right, that'll be the solution? Or does the voter say, I'm not so sure? And then they listen to Cavalier Johnson. Here's my multifaceted plan on crime. Does that ring true to the voter or not? So there are differences in approaches, and the voters can decide on that.
Okay. Anything we haven't talked about this spring election before we wrap this up that you guys have noticed or want to talk about? This is your forum.
I'll give a prediction on turnout.
Okay.
But if I'm wrong by tomorrow night, I want you to erase this tape.
It's live.
Are you promising?
Yeah.
I think it will be a relatively high turnout. If we had 1 in 5 in February, I think we're going to have at least 1 in 3, or might even have 40% tomorrow. That I think people.
Now that's higher than the Election Commission is calling for.
Yeah.
And they keep tabs on this thing. So I'm just saying, you're taking the over.
I'm taking the over. You want to take the under?
I'll take the under for sure on that.
No.
You don't agree? Or
No, I do agree. I mean, I think that I think that people have paid much more attention since the primary, and I think are really curious about, right, like what's going to happen and want to get their votes counted.
So you're going 40 up to 42.
Well, I would have said 1 and 3. So
Okay.
better
keeping
than,
it safe.
Yeah, better than the spring election.
Yeah. All right, you're shooting for the green. She's going to lay up a little bit
exactly.
there. Very good. Well, thank you both for your time.
Thanks for having us.
The insight is fascinating. I learned a lot in this conversation, and I hope you all did too. So don't forget to vote tomorrow. You can vote in person. You can register the same day. If we have inspired you to do that, then this 20 minutes was worth it. Have a good night.